Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. Now, we've blasted ahead and we're now in the realms of Kubernetes, but I think it's important that I go back and finish off some of the basics around firewalls. I'm often talking about things like network segmentation, vLANs, DHCP, services, hosts, static IPs, MAC addresses, and I haven't gone through that thoroughly enough. So in this video, I'm going to cover some of the firewall basics. We're going to be setting up things like static hosts. We're going to be putting machines on vLANs. I'm going to show you how to put some firewall rules in place so that we can segment our traffic and allow the ones that we want to be able to communicate with one another. And I'll also talk about things like VPNs and port forwarding so that you can expose some of your services. So let's dive straight into it. This video is going to focus on Sophos XG, but the overriding principles will be applicable to all firewalls, so things like pfSense, OpenSense, etc. Now, when logging into my firewall, I've been greeted with this message. So this is asking me to upgrade, and irrespective of whether this is Sophos or any of the other competitors, upgrading your firewall is really important. So do take heed of these warnings and do make sure that you provision times for when you need to upgrade your firewall. Fortunately for me, I have two firewalls in a high availability mode. I have a video on that if you want to go and check that out, but we're going to focus on some of the more basic items here. Now, when you upgrade your firewall, do make sure that you understand that it's going to bring your network down temporarily because your firewall is going to, well, in most cases, need to reboot. So if you've got things running like a Kubernetes cluster, do understand that there might be some impact there. If you're using things like a layer 3 switch, we'll come on to that later, that might not be an issue. So now we're in my firewall and you can see some interesting statistics. I'm not going to dive into this too much, but there are some things that might be important. So for example, this source is blocked from an ATP, and if we click on that, you can see that it's actually one of my internal servers and it's a false positive. In this case, it's probably my VPN connection because I've set it to alert for VPNs. And that's because often a piece of malware might try to do a VPN, a reverse VPN connection out, or it might be trying to connect to an IP that's within a range that is on the bad IP list. In this case, I can just ignore it. So one of the first things I want to do is to tell you how to pin a static IP address to a system or a service. So to do that, we need to go over to the Hosts and Services tab. Now, the reason you would want to do this is because it makes firewall rules simpler, and also for static IPs within your network, it makes sense from an administrative point of view. So for instance, in my setup, I make sure that I keep a record of all my internal IP addresses, because if things like my reverse proxy go down, I can no longer access them through a subdomain of jimsgarage.co.uk. I need to defer back to the IP address. This can be useful for things as simple as Docker, whereby you might have traffic.yourdomain.com. Once traffic's gone down, or your Pi-hole's gone down, or whatever your DNS resolver is, you need to fall back to an IP address. So within Sophos XG, we've got a few things we can do, and again, this is similar for all firewall vendors. So you can just click Add here, and then you can give it a host name, so you could have your Docker VM. I'm going to give it an IPv4, and it's of a type IP, so this is a single IP address. You can give it a network, or an IP range, or even an IP list. And then you would just put in your IP address here, and then that would create it. So I'm going to create test VM, and I'm going to give it an IP address of 192.168.3, and then I'm going to choose 95 because I know that that isn't taken at the moment. So I'm going to hit save, and interestingly, what that does is don't think that that's now been reserved. It hasn't been reserved because we haven't assigned a MAC address for it, and we haven't put it on a DHCP lease restriction. Do note that whilst we're here, you can have IP host groups. So this is a group of IPs you want to put together. So for example here, you can see my Kubernetes workers. So all my Kubernetes workers are within an IP host group. So on this previous page here, I've got all my Kubernetes saved individually, and then I've created a group to group them together. Now the benefit of that is it makes rules within my firewall much simpler. So I can just say all of the machines in my Kubernetes cluster have access to X, Y, or Z. So things like making sure they have access to the internet, making sure that they have access to my NAS, those sorts of things. It means that I don't have to put in 8 IP addresses, I can just assign the group. You can also do a similar thing based upon the Mac host. So you can create hosts based upon their MAC address, and that might be useful in certain circumstances. The rest of it, you can also do things like FQDN, so a fully qualified domain name. So here there's some in Sophos that are already created. And again, these get used within firewall rules. So you could say that all your machines have access to, let's pick one, boxcloud.com. Conversely, you could say no machines have access to boxcloud.com. And so you can add your own in here as well. If you wanted to block certain domains, you could create a record in here and then use it later in a firewall rule. We'll get onto firewall rules in a little bit. So that's kind of it from the IP side. The second side is the services. So things like ones I've added here, so things like Home Assistant, some game servers, Frigate. But if we go on to the next page, you'll also see that there's some basic ones that come provided with Sophos. So you can just add these as you wish. And again, this makes firewall rules simpler and it assigns it to something that is human readable rather than just a service or a port. Similarly, again, you can then just group those up if you wanted to. So it might be your server group. You know all the ports that your servers need, and so you can group them up nicely. Now that we've created a service and we've assigned an IP address to a machine, let's go and add that to a DHCP lease on a vLAN. So to do that, we're first going to need to create a vLAN. How do we do that? Well, to create a vLAN here, we need to go over to the Network tab. And on the Interfaces tab, we need to click Add an Interface. Now, you can see on my existing Sophos XG setup, I've got port A, which is a physical NIC on my machine, which is for my LAN. So this goes straight into the switch and everything else on there accesses it through the trunk port. The second bit is my internet. So this is literally my router, or my router which is actually in modem only mode, plugged straight into, in my case, my firewall, but via the switch. And the last one gives you an indication of how I do that. And I've covered this extensively in my HA video and also in my Homelab tour. So I have two firewalls set up and there's a dedicated link between the two firewalls so that they know which one is available. And if that link goes down, it should fail over to the next firewall. And so I've already created this testing VLAN, which I use for most of my videos. But to do that, it's simple. We click on Add Interface, add a VLAN. We give it a name. In this case, I've called it testing. We say which interface we want it to be on. By default, that's port A, which is your LAN. Now, the zone, we can choose what it is. So you basically need to choose what this VLAN is going to be. So if this is an internal only network, i.e. not exposed to the internet, you'd probably call it LAN. If it's internet facing, so if it is your ISP modem or a second one, whatever, your access to the internet, you'd call that your WAN. And if you're exposing services to the internet, I recommend you set this as a DMZ. And then lastly, you've got the option of whether you want it to be a Wi-Fi. So choose your zones accordingly, because in the firewall rules section later, we actually have to reference what zone it is because zones apply to rules. Now that you've done that, you need to give it a VLAN ID. So in my instance, I set this one to be 3. So this means that any traffic on this network will be tagged with VLAN tag 3. Now, I've got a video for one of my earlier ones about VLAN tagging, subnets, etc. Do go and check that out if you're not certain on what those concepts are. Lastly, we need to put in an IPv4 mask. Now, I keep this really simple. So in my instance, because it's a 3, I use the 3/24 notation. So that will look like this. So that's 192.168.3.1. And because that's a 24, we get 254 usable addresses. And that's pretty much all you need to do to create this VLAN. So go ahead and hit save once you've configured this, and then you'll be returned back to the interfaces page, and you should see it. Let's go and have a look at that now. So now in my interfaces tab, I can see that testing VLAN, and I can see that it's been set up as a 3.1 in the /24 range. It's using VLAN ID 3. Brilliant. So if we click on that, we can actually go in now and have a look, and you'll see exactly the same page as when we created it. This is good because it allows you to edit it. So that's fine. We've now got a VLAN set up. Now, there's a bit of stuff outside of the firewall that you'll need to set up to make sure that this works. So, for example, over in Proxmox, you can see I've got my primary firewall here, my active, and on my second one, you can see that I've got my passive firewall. The important thing is we have to put this into what's called promiscuous mode or VLAN aware. So if I click on my Proxmox Dell server, and this will be the same for my Asus one, and then if I click onto my network, you can see that I've got all my network adapters listed here. And I've conveniently named them here on the right hand column so that I know what everything is. So in my instance, I've got VMBR1, which is actually using Eno 2, which is this one here, number 2. That's set as my Sophos XG trunk. So this is my LAN port. And now if I click on this machine and I click edit, you can see that I've got here ticked, it's VLAN aware. So this is that promiscuous mode, the VLAN aware that I was talking about. What that does is it means it can pass multiple MAC addresses from the same IP, and VLAN tags are also understood. So it knows that it's going to expect lots of traffic from lots of different VLANs. So do make sure that that is enabled, otherwise your VLANs won't work. Let's head back into Sophos now. So once you've configured your Proxmox, and that will be the same no matter what firewall you're using, we can now go over to DHCP. Now, you don't have to use DHCP, you can use everything statically, but I like to use DHCP and use leases. So over here, if it hasn't already created it during the wizard, you need to click add. So when you click add, you need to give it a name. So I could call this one testing. And then I need to select the interface. Now we know that we created it on port A, but if you remember, it was port A.3 because it's on that 3 VLAN. So if we go down, we can see testing, and there we go. We validate that it's got the right IP address. So if I now click that, we've set the name and we've set it to testing, and then we need to start and stop the IP lease address. So these are dynamic. So this means when you plug an Ethernet port in or you spin up a VM, it's tagged with this VLAN, it's going to pick up an IP from this range. So you can choose whatever you want. Typically, I just choose anything 100 plus. So I'll do 192.168.3 and I'll do 100 and then end it. Let's give it 100. So now anything that is plugged into this VLAN automatically will be given an IP address somewhere between 100 and 200. It's typically sequential. Importantly now, what we can do is we can do a static map. So what this means is if we go over and give it a MAC address, when that machine is presented to the DHCP server, it's already reserved an IP. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if I head over to my Proxmox, and if I create a new virtual machine, so I'm going to clone using my cloud init. Check out my video if you haven't done already. I'm going to create a full clone, and we'll call this one test DHCP. I'm just going to clone that one. And now if I click on it and then go to the hardware tab, you'll see here that there's a network device. So if I just click edit and then copy this here, so copy, I can now put this into Sophos or whichever firewall you're using, and I can give it an IP address that's outside of this range. So 192.168.3, and then I'm going to choose 45 because I know arbitrarily that that isn't taken. I can also give this a host name. So let's call it test DHCP. And now that's the name associated to that MAC address and IP, so that anything in my firewall that is flagged or needs a rule, it will look like this in the logs. The last thing we need to do is, remember, this is a VLAN. So back in Proxmox, we need to give this a VLAN tag. So number 3. And then we can hit OK. I'm going to give this a little bit more space, just in case it causes any issues. So give it an extra 5. And now, before we hit start on the virtual machine, we want to make sure that we save this. Now, importantly, I've also set use the interface IP as the gateway, and that's defaulted to 3.1. If you had a different gateway, i.e. another exit point like a router on your network, you could specify this here, and you do that by unselecting this. You might also want to specify additional DNS servers, but I'm just going to use the device's DNS settings, which I've set to my pi hole. So when I click that, you can see that it's my primary pi hole and my secondary backup pi hole. Once that's done, we're okay and we can hit save. Now that has saved, we can go back into Proxmox and we can hit start. So when this machine starts up now, we're going to expect it to pick up the 3.45 IP address. Let's hop in now and let's validate that that took place. So now logged into this machine, let's do an IPA. And then hopefully with any luck, yeah, we see here 192.168.3.45. So it's as simple as that to put a machine on a VLAN with a reserved IP address. Now heading back into Sophos, another important thing is to set your DNS server. Now you can do this on a VM level, but I prefer to do it in my firewall. And if you remember in that previous bit where we set up the VLAN, we could specify whether we wanted it to use a static DNS, i.e. the default. And I've done that here, so I've set a static DNS and I've pointed it to both of my DNS resolvers. Therefore, each machine, whenever it's requesting DNS, it'll be pointed to these servers in this order first. So do understand that there is a preference here. If it can't find it within DNS server 1, it will try DNS server 2. So now that we have machines tied to IP addresses through MAC addresses, we've created a VLAN, we've set DNS. Let's do some firewall rules. So I'm going to demonstrate some inter-VLAN routing now. So I'm going to take the same example, so back in Proxmox, we've got my test DHCP machine, which if you remember is 3.45. I'm going to ping a different VLAN on my network. Now, Sophos by design is default deny, i.e. it doesn't allow inter-VLAN traffic. Other firewall vendors are default allow, so just be aware of that. But if I run a ping against 200.50, which is my testing Docker VM, so what I use for these videos, and hit return, nothing's happening. It's not getting access to that. So let's assume that this machine needs access to my Docker host. How do we fix that? Well, we need to head back into Sophos and we need to create a firewall rule. So to create firewall rules, we handily go to rules and policies. Within here, we need to create a new firewall rule. So new firewall rule, I'm going to give this a rule name. So I'm going to call this test-DHCP to Docker VM. The default is going to be it accepts this traffic. Remember, you can do deny traffic. And I'm going to put this rule position, I'm just going to put it at the top. That means that it supersedes all other rules, and this is for testing. Now, you do need to determine whether that's a good idea, because rules are hierarchical. The ones at the top override the ones below it. Most commonly, you might have things like a geo block at the top, and you might always want that to be at the top. There are also lots of other reasons why you have orders for rules, but do make sure that this is in the right place. And also note that don't worry too much, because on the next page, once you've completed the rule, you can drag and drop it up and down. Now, you might want to log this firewall traffic, so turn that on if you want to see this logged. The important bit, however, is if we scroll down. So the source zone. Now remember, I told you about the importance of zones. Now we know that VLAN 3 was set up as LAN, so I'm going to tick LAN. Click apply. The source network and devices. Now, if I do this and leave it as any, it means that any of my VLANs or LANs that are set up as LAN, this rule will apply to. We don't want that. So we're going to hit the minus and we're going to hit add a new item. So for this, I probably want to create a new IP range. So for that, I can do an IP range. And I'm going to call this one test DHCP range. And it's going to be an IP range. So we know that 192.168.3.1 all the way up to 192.168.3.255. Now, we know that that is the full IP range, so I'm just going to hit save. Now we've got test DHCP. So now that's added. So what that's saying is it has to be on the LAN and it has to be anything within this VLAN. This rule is going to apply all the time, but you can choose this to happen at certain times in the day. The destination zone, again, we need to specify which zone it's going to. So it could be a DMZ server, it could be a VPN, a WAN, a Wi-Fi, but in this case, my Docker VM for my testing is still on my LAN. It's on a separate VLAN, but it's also on a LAN. So I'm going to click apply. Now the destination network is also important. If we left this as is, it would mean that anything within that 3 VLAN would have access to anything on any service that is also in the LAN group. So I want to be far more prescriptive. I want to limit that to 1 machine. So again, going to hit that minus and I'm going to click add a new item. So I'll click add and then I want an IP. And so this is my Docker VM. It has an IP address of 192.168.200.50. I know that from testing and various videos. And then I'm just going to scroll down and click save. Now that that's saved, we have a specific firewall rule. Now, it's only specific to anything in this range. If I wanted to, I could actually make this different and I could specify it specifically to just that VM. Now, to do that, I'd add a new VM and I would put in that test machine that we created earlier. Now, I actually set that, if you hover over this, to 3.95 and then I changed the DHCP lease to 45. Did that deliberately because you can click the pencil and you can just change that. So let's put in 45 and then click save. So not only has that added it, it's also changed it. And now if we wanted to, we could make this rule only apply to that virtual machine. So no longer is it the range. What this is saying now is only this VM can talk to this VM and they're on separate VLANs. Now the services as well, you can change this to whatever you want. Any is typically not advised because it's too open and you'd want to restrict it to all of the services that you want. So you can go through this list and choose whatever you want. Or you can also add a service or service group, remember we can create those, on the fly. I'm just going to leave this as any for a demonstration purpose, but do tweak this to whatever you require. So now when I hit save, fingers crossed, we should head back into Proxmox and then we should see it automatically start pinging and we get a response. So let's hit save and head into Proxmox. So now that rule should be changed, and here we go, instantly we're getting ping, we're getting a response. Awesome, we know now that our firewall rule is working and it's prescriptive, i.e. it's single machine to single machine. So let's cancel this and we're going to head back into Sophos. So now we put that rule in place, you can see at the top it's been successful and we've validated that it's working. So how do we see it? Well, it's been added to one of these sections here. Now, it's not traffic to WAN because it's not going to the internet and it's not traffic to the DMZ. No, it's traffic to internal. And if we click on that, you can see that it's at the top here. Test DHCP to the Docker VM, and it's got the exact thing that we configured. And you can see already that there's been 924 bytes of traffic in and out. That's that ping response. Now that we've created that rule for inter-VLAN traffic, how do you create one for a port forward? Now, for some people out there, you don't have the luxury of port forwarding, but thankfully I've got things like my head scale video, which will show you how to circumvent that, certainly if you're behind things like a CG NAT. So to do a port forward in Sophos XG, it's really straightforward. We just want to click on NAT rules, and then we want to create add a NAT rule. So this will be a new server access assistant or a destination NAT. So because we're going from a single external IP address to many IP addresses internally or potentially, that's why we need network address translation. It's that one-to-many layer. So we're going to click on the server access assistant, and then you simply need to walk through these 5 steps to get it up and working. So let's say we want access on a certain port to go to that test VM we created. So we want to select the IP host. So this is the machine that you want to be exposed. So if we do test, we can click it here, and that's the IP address we had, and then we can click next. We want to select the IP address or the WAN interface. So in my instance, it's that port B. You can see that here on screen. We then click next. Then, similarly to the firewall, you want to specify which services can be accessed. So why don't we say HTTPS? So now that that's selected, it means that port 443 is exposed externally and it's going to route that traffic through to that virtual machine. So you could change this to anything you want. If it's a Jellyfin server, a Plex server, a mail server, you just need to add the services here. And you can add more than one. So maybe we also have HTTP for port 80 traffic. So this would be typical for a web proxy. So let's click next. Now it's going to say, well, where do you want the traffic to come from? Typically, if this is internet facing in Enterprise, you'd probably have this as any. So you can have traffic from anywhere. And then the firewall on top of that, certainly if it's a next gen firewall, will have a list of known bad IPs and it will block those from this pool. But just like the firewall we did previously, you could be extremely restrictive on this. So you could even put in things like you only want IP addresses from certain countries. So you could do things like United Kingdom. So if I apply this, it means that only IP addresses within the UK's range can access my services. You can obviously change this to whichever territories you want, or you can even restrict this to your friends' IP addresses if you're just sharing game servers and you don't want this exposed elsewhere. Do note that their IP address may change over time, so you might want to tie this to a DNS record. So let's click next, and then we're going to get a summary of what we've just selected. So we've said IP host 3.45 with that host name. This is the internet connection it's going to come through. These are the services that it can use, and this is where the traffic can come from. And then it's going to create two NAT rules to translate the external to the internal, and it's going to create one firewall rule, i.e. that outside to in is allowed on this port. So when we click save and finish, that will create those NAT rules and also the firewall rules, and it will look something like this. So you'll typically then have a DNAT rule. So here I've got my DNAT rule to my proxy, but this is just for testing. I don't actually have anything exposed. On my firewall tab, you'll then see a firewall rule that's to the proxy. So again, here you'll see that. So you need a network address rule and a firewall rule, and that wizard will create it for you. So once that's in place, and as you've seen through many of my videos, you can then access stuff from external, i.e. the internet, onto your local machine. Once we've done that, you've actually got some of the core functionality of the firewall in place, and probably most of the things that you'd typically want to use for a home lab. Once you've got those rules in place, however, you can just click on them and you can enhance them. So if you click on a rule and scroll down, you can actually add in some security features. So you can turn on things like the web filtering, so you can put policies on what people can do on the web, and you can also do things like decrypting it, i.e. creating a man-in-the-middle attack, a good man-in-the-middle attack, to actually inspect some of that traffic. Now, do note that this is a bit of a dark art and it will break some services. So whilst it is good to be able to decrypt HTTPS traffic and detect payloads inside them, a lot of services are designed to specifically detect this type of decryption and not work. So your mileage may vary. But you can turn all of that on in here. You can also look at some of the traffic shaping. So if you wanted to, for example, you could drop peer-to-peer networking on that connection. And this might be useful if you've got certain networks that you don't want to allow that, or maybe you've got children, you don't want them to access certain types of websites or perform certain sorts of services, things like torrenting, etc. Now, Sophos XG will also do VPNs. And there's lots of different types of VPN that it supports. And it also does both client to server, and it also does site to site. Now, I don't actually touch any of this stuff. I used to use it, but it uses OpenVPN in the background, and that's a bit heavy. And I actually recommend you don't use any of this here, and you use something like WireGuard hosted in Docker, which I've got some videos on. The reason for that is it's typically more performant and more secure. And I hope it's only a matter of time before Sophos wake up and join the WireGuard crowd. But it's actually quite interesting. The adoption of WireGuard isn't actually that widespread within the enterprise space. One other thing that's important, and we kind of touched on it at the start, if we go to backup and firmware, you want to set up some backups. So I do this through email, and it sends me an encrypted copy of my config every week on a Sunday night. Now this is really useful because if ever your firewall is destroyed for whatever reason, be it virtual, physically, whatever, you should be able to deploy a new firewall and restore your configuration. This is obviously really useful because you don't want to have to remember all of those MAC addresses, IP addresses, host names, all of the rules, etc. You should be able to restore this back and be up and running in a relatively short amount of time. One other thing that's really useful is dynamic DNS. So if we go back into the networking tab, and on the top right, you can see dynamic DNS. Now, a lot of people that have residential internet won't have a static IP address, or they're either paying extra money to have a static IP address. The beauty of this is it comes with dynamic DNS, which means that for people who don't have a static IP address, myself included, this will tie into your domain provider and actually update your IP address in real time. So here you can see that jimsgarage.co.uk is tied to Cloudflare. It's got my IP address and when it was last updated. So this is constantly checking the record within Cloudflare, and anytime this changes, it will go and update it. So to do that, it's really straightforward. You just hit add. You need to select your provider, and there's a few in here. If you don't have one of these, unfortunately, it's not going to work. But there are Docker-based solutions that you can use, and also just binaries, and there's even things like cron jobs you can use. So for me, I would just click Cloudflare. I would add in my email address, and I'd get my global API key, and I'd hit save. And that's pretty much it. The only thing you'd want to do is from here, select your WAN port, and you need to give it a name. Once you do that and hit save, it will show up on the previous page and it should be up and running, and hopefully you'll see a last updated time, and I think it runs it the first time. So thanks for watching, everybody. That was just a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the basic sort of 101 functions of a firewall. Typically for a home lab, this is going to take the brunt of your security. It's the first step to get into your home lab, and arguably it's what's going to segment your network. So now you've got the ability to put things on vLANs and create specific rule sets and also expose them to the internet with some security measures in place. As I said, I've used Sophos XG, I like the product, but there's other firewalls out there that I also highly rate. And this process, or this concept of segmenting your network and putting specific rules in place, is applicable to all of those. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.